A few weeks ago, a movie got published called Clouded. If you haven't seen it or heard of it, make sure to check it out. I put the link down in the description. I, of course, watched it because my great friend Thomas Maurer is in it, and I'll be willing to watch most movies that he possibly could participate in. Now, the movie embarks on a journey to discover what is the cloud, what is the impact from a technical standpoint, but also from a society or a company culture of how IT has to approach this cloud thing. Great movie, really, you should watch it. It has great people in it that answer their experiences, what they think about it. So absolutely a must-see, I think, for anybody in IT. I'm very happy that they made such documentary. Around the same time, I read this blog post of a person, I don't know the company, describing their journey going from the cloud to the on-premises. And in both the movie and this article inspired me. I felt like I should address those very big, almost 5 elephant in the rooms, or topics or concerns that come up in so many of the customer discussion, in so many. So today I want to share with you some food for thoughts about these common 5 urban legends when it comes to the cloud. So the first urban legend is vendor lock-in. There is a fear and a common misconception, I mean it's technically true, but hear me out, that when you go to the cloud, the cloud platform operator has you in its grips and what would stop them from increasing the price on you like crazy and, keep your data hostage? Well, that's maybe a risk, vendor lock-in. However, I'd argue, aren't you locked in anyway? I mean, right now, in any enterprise, specifically if it's a large enterprise, there's a high likelihood you have big Oracle instances for ERP or SAP. Now, what's your alternative? If any of those would change the licensing pricing tomorrow, how fast can you move? For most enterprise, this will be a multi-year journey to even get off of that platform. This is not going to be overnight. This is not going to be in a month. This is not going to be in 2 months. The same holds true for your desktop or work suite that you do all your work in, because like if you use Office Word, you probably have so many add-ons, or like your accounting system prints invoices through Word. All this would need to be updated. And what about the hardware vendors? In the end, there is 2 chip manufacturers, Intel, AMD. So from a technical standpoint, I would argue that already you are in a big vendor lock-in. The same holds true, by the way, for your virtualization layer like VMware. But it's not just in technology where we have these dependencies. For example, several European countries ordered the F-35 fighter jets from the US. And besides that they send a lot of telemetry to the US, there's a vendor lock-in. You can't just modify it, you can't just fix it. If they turn off software updates, it basically renders your Air Force useless, because the jet will not get any of these critical updates it needs, because it's very software driven, this whole approach. And so even there, even in the defense of your airspace, you kind of have a vendor lock-in. Big countries may have more than one fighter jet. Switzerland decided to just go with the F-35. So it's not even just in software or technology, which we are very familiar with. It's in very sensitive and critical areas to the sovereignty of a nation, like their Air Force, where they have vendor lock-ins, where they have strong dependencies. So I'm not sure why the fear is so big in the cloud, because time over and over again has shown that if companies take advantage of their monopoly position in the market, governments will investigate, governments will fine. And besides that, most of the hyperscaler are public traded companies and they want to grow. The last thing they want to do is upset customers or even show that they've ever done. I would have yet to see where a hyperscaler held any customer hostage. Now, before we move on to the next one, I quickly have to put a jacket on because this is getting serious. This one is the elephant in the room, the Cloud Act, or government's access to your data. This is a big concern and so much smoke for so little. There's a great interview, I will also link it down below, between 2 attorneys. One is Martin Steiger and David Rosenthal. He's probably the expert when it comes to anything from Swiss with US cloud hyperscalers. Definitely worth checking him out. He even has a Rosenthal method, I think it's called, where it allows you to basically do risk assessment of what workloads you can move to the cloud or not. At least you will know the risk. In this podcast, he was talking about that actually the Cloud Act was invented in Europe. Surprise, surprise, surprise. For all my Swiss listener, you know the commercial with Ricola where this guy runs around. Wer hat's erfunden? Who invented it? The Swiss guy invented the Ricola. And it seems like Europe invented the Cloud Act. So you can read this up. I'm also linking this down below. So the Cybercrime Convention Article 18 from the European Union describes this. Switzerland has basically similar laws that would allow in criminal investigations to force a company to provide data, even if the data is stored in a data center outside of the country. And as you can imagine, this is something actually we want. If something were to happen to you or a loved one and police would investigate, we want them to get information legally that are relevant to their investigations. We want the right controls in place, of course, but we want them to get information. And that is true for consumer services, chat, social media, that if the police has a lead, has enough, and goes and knocks on the door of a provider of that service and says, hey, I'd like to know more about person X. Imagine they would just say, oh, sorry, servers in Germany can't give it to you. It's in Dublin, it's in Spain, you choose. And that actually is in fact not the only way how governments can access. So we established that the Cloud Act is not unique to the US. It's also the same law exists in Europe, where European companies are governed, like most likely your employer if you work in the European Union, or Switzerland for that matter. But governments also get access to data they want in different methods. For example, should Switzerland trust Germany? You tell me. I mean, the German government, not just once, but twice, bought a CD full with information from a bank employee about citizens storing money in Switzerland. In most countries, Western countries, it's illegal to buy knowingly stolen goods. So it's a very illegal act to begin with. They knew the person didn't get that information in a legal manner, yet they purchased it. Did anything happen? No. They want to know. They found a way to get it to know. And it wasn't through hacking. It was simple because in most safety systems, security system, it's your employees that are usually the weak link. We can go as far back as to the Snowden revelations. And I also will post a link down below, where he talks about of extortion of bankers down there in his time in Geneva. He's even mentioning of buying information from a Swisscom employee. And that's actually not the first time in my professional career I come across this myth that some employee at Swisscom sells data to investigators. They were not in the clouds in both cases. But we can take it one step further. When the US wanted to know which are the Americans storing money in Switzerland, they asked, we said, sorry, Swiss law, can't tell you. Well, what did they do? Did they threaten us with sanctions, excluding us from trading in US dollars or something? And we sang like little birds. Our government collected the information, flew over, gave it to the Americans. Later, Congress had to vote because they just broke the law of what should happen. And then the US, knowing like just how much influence they have because of the big economy they are, said, okay, from now on forward, any financial institution that does any business with American citizens has to provide automatic data exchange like banks in the US. A lot of smaller banks didn't participate because now the Swiss law says you can't do that, so you had to have two completely different IT systems. So it's just large banks. I was impacted by it because my wife is American. Now she couldn't just choose any bank. I know of Americans living in Switzerland that have trouble getting a mortgage because most institutions don't have that automatic exchange or data exchange with the US government. So it's really bad for them. But there's obviously not enough of them living in Switzerland to make enough stank that US laws would change. So then what is the worry? We clearly established that not just the US has a Cloud Act, in fact, got invented in Europe. We established Cloud Act or not, governments always get their hands on information. If that is through the illegal way, and it's not always through hacking, it's extortion, it's buying it outright, just greed of employees. It's like, oh, sure, that's a way to make some millions, to just threatened with embargoes that have economically disastrous impact on the country. Like I said, a lot of smoke for nothing. Why are we concerned? Please tell me. Leave it in the comments. I look forward to hear your argument. Why are you concerned about the Cloud Act? The next urban legend is data is the new oil. And I'm not saying data is the new oil. I agree with that, just as oil was the new gold. I'm just saying the myth associated with it. One of the arguments you hear a lot is that if data is so valuable, it's the new oil. It's basically, so from gold to oil to data. Shouldn't we as a sovereign nation want to bunker it all inside because it's so valuable we should hold on to it? There is an argument that much of the data is stored in the US and China. You read that in articles about the benefits these countries have when it comes to AI. And I'm not denying that. I'm not an expert on the topic. If you compare it with oil, I would just ask you, did your country have enough oil to satisfy the demand in the economy, in your economy? Or was oil also concentrated in a few spots around the world? And we actually have a huge dependencies. We see that every time there's a crisis and, oil spikes everywhere because most countries do not have oil that they need, or maybe they have some, but definitely not enough. So what's different? Even if I go before oil with gold, there's a lot of gold stored abroad in countries like Switzerland, I think Luxembourg, and some fancy islands around the world. They have a lot of the value stored. So what's the difference? If data is the new oil, then why is that a concern if so much is stored outside of your country? It's not like you don't have these dependencies anyway. Leave it in the comments. What's different? And even though money was stored outside of your nation, even the oil you had to import, most countries in Europe and the US have done very well when it comes to wealth over the past 50, 60 years. It's crazy how far we have come, and I just listened to the stories. So even though none of these countries had all the gold and none of these countries had all the oil, somehow we survived. Actually, we didn't just survive, we pretty much flourished. We're all doing better today than we did in the 40s. Another urban myth is that the cloud is not ready for mission critical. They cite outages of Amazon or AWS is out, takes a third of the internet down because I think Netflix is hosted on it. Don't quote me on it. I think it was the case, still the case. And so the dependency of these cloud providers is huge. Therefore, it might be not ready. Or that's why maybe you should take your e-commerce platform from the cloud to your on-premises. But even then, you can't escape the cloud because maybe, let's say, the delivery service you use to ship the packages still is in the cloud, and they might still be impacted if a hyperscaler platform goes down. But let me ask you this. Didn't we have major outages in on-premises? In Switzerland, stores are not open on Sunday. Before the holidays, there is a few Sundays where they have open, and it's like, I think, the most revenue-driven days for many of the stores in Zurich. And I remember a time when all the credit cards or debit card payments, basically the system was out. All the stores were impacted. That wasn't in the cloud. That was the provider that provides these terminals for stores to accept payments with card. Huge revenue loss because even ATMs eventually run out of money and people can't get that kind of cash or have to leave. It's busy, the stores are full. It was a nightmare scenario. I can go on. Just recently when we look about people whose data got encrypted, and then they get extorted. Huge problem. How many companies got? And how long was the software update out there available? Most companies neither have the processes, tools, or people, skills that is needed to patch as fast systems as the hyperscaler do. They just don't. They can't spend that money. And then when you look at the cloud, sure, you have a dependencies. If the cloud goes down, you're impacted. I think it was 2016 where the whole East Coast in the United States went dark internet-wise. Surprisingly, you could still go to Amazon.com. Now, the outage wasn't because of an AWS outage. Everybody at the East Coast was impacted. I think it was all the DNS servers basically went down. Something like this attacked from a bot network. And some of the other big retailers that are competing with Amazon, they were no longer reachable even for people in the West Coast. These retailers voiced their frustrations. Why is Amazon working, but we're not? Turns out that Amazon didn't just deploy in one region with availability zones, but in multiple regions. This thing called disaster recovery, where you had this other data center far away. And that might not be needed for all workloads, but if you're probably Amazon.com, I have no idea how much revenue they make in a minute downtime or lose in a minute downtime. It's worth for them to spend the money. So the cloud is absolutely ready for mission critical. Some of the most valuable companies in the world operate in the cloud. So all their mission critical stuff. So saying it's not ready, it's just that. It's an urban legend. It's an urban myth. However, that said, It is your responsibility to design and architect, hire the skills, invest in training your people to make sure you make smart choices when adopting cloud technologies. Like Amazon did. Don't just go in one region. If it's that mission critical, when companies have big outages and it turns out it was running on a single server instance, not even in an availability set. So what do they think that's going to happen? So if that was your strategy and you were disappointed because you were hit with an outage, then sure. I'm not saying hyperscalers never have an outage. I say it can happen. But I say they have all pretty good availability, and when it happens, it's bad. I remember a time when I was working in the US where California offices were hit a lot with phone outages and all the phone systems didn't work. Huge trauma, very regular. So that an outage can happen. If it happens to you, if you're impacted, it's the worst thing. No doubt about that. But it happened before the cloud. It may happen a little bit less in the cloud. I'm not saying it's not happening. But if you are the assumption it's not ready for critical workloads, I would say think again. Look what others do. Look just how many companies move SAP out there to hyperscaler, which is mission critical for many. I would even argue that email is very mission critical, and so many companies trust that to the cloud. And the last urban legend I want to address is cost. Surprisingly, whenever I discuss cost, I have yet to find CFOs that feel the same way as IT does. It's also very hard to compare. Some companies just compare the cost of their servers or licensing because facility costs or the service, the maintenance of those facility costs is not directly deducted from their cost center, but it's maybe a different department and it's in there. From a CFO perspective, that doesn't matter, still associated with IT. Now, I'm not saying there's never going to be a workload that potentially could run cheaper. I had this discussion specifically with smaller businesses where it's like they just want an email address, but they really don't need Office. So would you really buy an Office 365 license? Now, to be fair, Office is solving that with different packages now that they didn't have a few years ago when I had those discussions. Even if you are that great at knowing your cost and you truly down to the square footage your racks needs, the power, the cooling, the maintenance part for that. Even if you take all that in consideration and compare it with the cloud, I would argue it's not a fair comparison. How many internet connections do you have in your on-premises? 1, 2? How many entry points does a cloud have? What's the physical security you automatically get by using a hyperscaler versus your on-premises? It's not just that server room door. So even in the base price, there is so much you benefit from the overall investments. Now, while hyperscalers sell you more advanced security technologies, at the end of the day, the hyperscaler, Microsoft, billions of dollars, thousands of IT security specialists that guard our cloud services on a day-to-day basis versus your router/firewall. And if you're larger, you may have a team, and that team has how much experience if there is ever an attack? So even if you don't use advanced features, your security footprint just increased. So you get way more value for $1 spent in a hyperscaler, I argue, than you get in your own premises. It might have been in the article I read where he's like, we spent $500,000 for all these things too. I think they were with Amazon. And he's like, how many beefy servers I can buy on premises for $500,000? I said, sure, you can, I think, buy some decent things. However, again, it's not just buying the servers, but you also need $500,000. If you're in the cloud, in that OPEX, CAPEX world, guess what? If you start business and you use a lot of resources, you pay a lot of money. But you also make money that should allow you to pay the bill. There was one, I think it was either the CIO or CEO of one of the big pharmaceutical companies in the world who said, in their world where they do a lot of testing that is compute intense, he says they spend over $1 billion in their infrastructure. But he says, first you need to make $1 billion that you can spend it. And he says the risk with the cloud was that a bunch of PhD students, I don't know, whatever, with a credit card technically have access to more compute than they have. And they don't have to wait and sell coughing syrup or I don't know what pharmaceuticals do to make $1 billion so they can make that investment. And more often than not, the reason why cost can catch you by surprise is because the cloud is like IT in the cloud is like a kid in a candy store. What? I can just click here, boom, and it deploys. If we go back to bare metal servers and then virtualization came along and virtualization promised us that the utilization of a bare metal server will increase from below 10% to 80-90%. And then I think it was a Gartner report who said that even in the virtualized world, we're still below 20% utilization. And if you go to the cloud, it's no difference because people often don't get trained by their employers, don't obtain the necessary skills, so they bring the legacy mindset. And so like the legacy mindset is like, deploy bigger than we need. Let's be on the safe side. And let's run everything 24/7. But they don't need everything 24/7. They just simply don't. So today, how many companies have actually a cloud competence center that focuses on cost and cost optimization? The tools are plenty. Invoices are complicated, but the tools to make sense, and if you want to drive governance, you can definitely be super cost efficient. In fact, more cost efficient than you can be on premises. In the on-premises world, if you shut down a VM, the underlying server is still running and consuming the thing because you also have other workloads. In the cloud, you put one workload to sleep, well, there you go. It's asleep. Now it's just storage cost, which you can almost ignore at this time. But yeah, just saying it is cheaper, flat out, I say it's definitely more valuable and you can maybe use it, or you most likely can use it way more cost efficient and maybe even decrease your cost and provide more value if you do it right. But it requires you to make it a priority and not just a afterthought. Can anyone survive alone? Any one nation, any one country? I say where we are today, we've gotten here together through globalization. A lot of the Western world that I know, I grew up in Europe, Switzerland to be exact, now in the US, trade agreements, help, assistance. It wasn't us alone. And even when I look at most recent developments in the world, the war in the Ukraine, they wouldn't be anywhere if it wouldn't be for assistance they get from other nations. Even Russia in its recent attacks, so the news reported, purchased or acquired drones. I think it was Iran or Syria. Sorry if I got this wrong. But they acquired the drones somewhere else. So they didn't do it themselves. Second World War. NATO is an alliance. Here in IT, we discuss so often about how we should do it all on our own. But to truly do it on your own, you shouldn't use any American technology if that's the fear you try to protect against. So we always going to have allies. Other countries, other nations that come to our aid, other nations to do business with, other nations we can invest in. Our pension funds in Switzerland invest in technology companies because they're quite very profitable. We are so interconnected, and moving it all on premises, is that the solution? And are you really truly breaking free from that vendor lock-in? What you're using there, are you going to make all your own inside the nation that doesn't sell that technology? Sure, open source, but do you have people in the open source community that will develop even if you're being cut off of the rest of the world, if that doomsday scenario is what you're trying to protect against? Now, the edge and on-premises will always exist, and I'm not against that. I actually think Microsoft does a freaking great job, and in fact, they even do it outside of Azure. You still have Exchange servers in this world. You can read the headlines when there is security attacks, people need to patch them. You have Windows Server, you have Hyper-V, there's so much. And if the cloud and hybrid cloud, you got Arc, you got HCI, we have Azure Stacks, there's like so much that you can take advantage to make sure you can run the workload where you need. So it's not about moving it all to the cloud. And to quote one more time the movie Clouded, a gentleman in the end closes it with saying, run the right workload in the right place for the right reasons. And I think this is key, for the right reasons, not because of urban legends. We established vendor lock-in, exists not just in IT, it doesn't just exist, it's not a new concept, it's always been there. Plus self-protection of the platform providers that don't just want to lose all the customers. It might help them in a short-term gain, but not in the long term. Because extort once a customer, you're probably it, that's done. Talked about the Cloud Act, how governments get access to your data regardless of where you store it. There is a way, and besides that, Europe has the same laws, so does Switzerland. Talked about the urban myth of data being the new oil and that it's problematic if it's not stored in your notion, in your nation, just as never all your money was stored in your nation, or just as not every nation had enough oil to satisfy the demand of its economy. We also talked about mission-critical workloads and the dependencies. What if the cloud platform provider has downtime or an outage? and that this isn't new, and that you have to make smart decision for your business critical application to deal with these situations. And even if you do that, there might still be an outage. But even if you're on premises, you're not, there's not no outages. I feel more comfortable in the cloud knowing the investments in that area, processes and tools they have and provide to patch systems, underlying systems that on-premises just usually doesn't have. And then we talked about cost and why it's so important to make that a real priority. In the end, I believe the world got here where we are today because of each other, even through the worst of crisis, things that happened before I came alive, things going forward, how we deal with the crises, the fact that we can exchange idea, goods, things, medicine. This is important. This brought us here where we are today. And so instead of trying to put on an aluminum hat and go back, why not? Why not look more forward? Why not try and motivate our elected leaders to come together and come up with standards? As an example, and I'm not saying this is possible, hear me out, physical goods are shipped every day in big masses, and each nation's border control has the rights to open a container to see if it contains what the manifest says it should contain. If it says it's chocolate in it, we can open it and see if it's chocolate or not. If it's cars, same. What if there would be a possibility for a data protocol that if we put all the smartest people together that could be inspected by different countries? But most importantly is it's together, not against each other, because no matter what the future holds, none of us, even a mighty country like the US, is able to do it alone. The US has partners, allies in the world where they have military bases and other things. So it's us together. And so that's what I would encourage you. It's like, please make sure you check out all the resources. If you live in Europe, specifically Switzerland, check out David Rosenthal. If you have real concerns, I would honestly say hire an attorney like him. He might be, I don't know his rate, but I'm assuming because he's a top expert that it comes with, like some budget requirements, but it's worth it. The benefit, if you then afterwards have the freedom to run the right workload in the right place for the right reasons, that is so valuable and will allow your company to faster innovate, provide better customer service, etc. Don't forget to watch the film, and if you're a tech at heart, specifically on the IT Pro side, make sure you follow my good friend Thomas Maurer. I hope you enjoyed this lengthy podcast and you made it all the way to the end. If so, please give me a thumbs up. Please think about subscribing. I would appreciate the support, and click the little bell so you get notified if I publish a new video. And with that, D-Dave Kurt out.